Nissan Lagoon. I began to be worried in the sea of celebs. Our rate of progress at first was no better than in the Sulu Sea, yet as far as I was able to discover, this should have been the best section of the voyage. The worst was still to come. The really difficult part would begin when we were clear of the Sea of Celebs, and were trying to make easting through the Southern Carolines. I could not then solace myself with the unusual reflection that the poor progress of one section of the voyage would be made up for by good in another. I was in the only sea from which I had any reasonable expectation of tolerable conditions. It began seriously to look as if the northern passage would be impossible, and I ruefully considered trying instead to work to the southward through the Strait of Macassar, if I could, and so out into the Indian Ocean by one of the central passages, and then southwards to Australia. 5 days after sailing from Chagos Bay, it was still calm of that depressing, hot, and stifling order that only those seas can breed. Calm so deep it becomes impossible to remember that there ever has been wind, or to conceive again a picture of the sea in which the wind blows. It was so dead that the clouds were mirrored perfectly in the sea by day and the stars by night, and the sails hung down so lifelessly that half their shade was gone. The helmsmen, barebacked, sweltered in their sweat at the open wheel. The pitch bubbled and spilled out over the clean decks. The drinking water had become insufferably hot and always overside. Where we might have swum, there lurked huge sharks. The galley refuse of 3 days still lay alongside, not moving. Some empty tins thrown overboard 2 days out from Bongao were still there on the 5th day, for there had never been slop enough on the sea to overbalance them and fill them. They glinted at us in the mornings and lay beside us all day. They caught the rays of the morning sun on the one side and the rays of the evening on the other, and we looked at those tins until the sight of them became so unendurable a reminder of our stagnation that I put the dinghy over and pushed them down. Calm, the refuse still stayed. I could not make that sink. I did not care to use the engine, though it had been repaired again, as well as the second mate could do it, at Chagos Bay. If the Celebes Sea, where the monsoon ought to blow, was so bad, we should need more than 4 days' fuel to get to Australia. I hung on, waiting for a faint air of some description that we might use, and an adverse current set us in towards Hollow. The youthful Stormalong still kept out of sight as much as he was able. Beginning as a joke, the boys' anger in the course of the hot days became real enough. If the calm had continued any longer, they would actually have thought that Stormalong's rejection of the Melassa Princess was responsible for it. As it was, there were many threats to send him back in a boat, and I swore one day that I would start the engine and go back and hand him over. Even in these days, man against the elements finds it easy, natural, almost to revert to his old superstitions. It would not have been so great a step from our condition then to implicit belief in the ability of the princess to hold us in that calm. We haven't altered. But at last a breeze came, a faint doldrum air with rain. We moved on a little and had the Sulu Islands out of sight, and saw instead the heights of Mindanao and Sarangani, that former headquarters of the trade in slaves. There came at length a sunny morning, early in September, when we reached the Pacific at last, sailing grandly into the vast ocean with a bone in our old ship's mouth that had not been there for weeks. We entered the Pacific through the narrow gateway between Callao and Maror, north of the Sangi group, outermost of the Dutch Celebes. The wind was fresh and fair, and Callao, with its beaches and its hills and its coconut groves, seemed one of the prettiest islands we had ever seen. I should have liked to anchor there to pay a visit, but there was no port of entry and I had to hurry on. We sailed through tide rips off the northwest end and saw a large village on Maror, and all the prows out fishing sailed swiftly from our path, wondering perhaps what was this apparition come among them. A full-rigged ship had not passed that way for 30 years. Here we left the East Indies behind us, and I regretted I had seen so little of them that voyage. We had been only to Bolalong, Singapore, Balabac, Bongao. We'd seen a little more than the bare list might indicate. Of course, we had sailed through Bali Strait and Sapudi Strait, and had seen the fast boats of Madura with their funneled sails, and by Balwain and Karamata Strait, and by Sirayai and Subi Kashil. We'd seen Borneo at its northern end, and Cagayan, Sulu, and Mambahenauhon. Little enough indeed. We should have stayed 2 months at Chongos Bay, and gone to Ampapui and Sandakan, and made a boat trip up the Segama River, and gone in to see the bad folk of Bangui, probably as harmless and as libelled as the boatmen of Balimbing. It was strange how in earth each place it was the people somewhere else who were bad. I had only 2 years. I could not stay out longer than that. 2 years is too short a time in which to sail 100-foot square rigger round the earth, and I had to cross the Atlantic 3 times and sail its whole length twice. That was indeed the error in my journey. There was too much Atlantic. So we came to the Pacific, and with the aid of the Lord found the east setting counter-equatorial, and sailed on and on and on, a long, hot, hard road. It rained every day, and sometimes blew, though often we had days of doldrum conditions. The current was strong, and we progressed steadily to the eastward, to the western Carolines, past Sonsorol, and Palo Ana, and Mirir, and all those other low islands of the Japanese Mandate. We saw the blue streak of Sonsorol early one morning, but I did not go in there, neither there nor into any other of the Japanese islands. The Japanese are doubtless making good use of their mandated islands, but I have gathered that they wish to be undisturbed, and I did not take it on myself to disturb them. All I had against them was a lamentable tendency to look upon unheralded strangers as spies. I was not a spy, and did not wish to be taken for one, so I sailed by well out, my principal object at that stage of the voyage being to avoid islands rather than to call at them. At length we progressed until we had sufficient longitude run down to head southwards towards the strait between Bougainville and New Ireland. I turned south then, crossing the line for the 3rd time since leaving England, on the 49th day out of Singapore. So far our progress had not been so bad, all things considered, but it soon worsened. We found the doldrums again, stifling hot and calm, with the glassy sea sometimes ruffled, fleeting by faint whiffs of wind that went before the yards could be braced to them, and always seemed to take the ship aback, robbing her in sternway of far more than they would have sent her ahead. There was a long uneasy swell, as if the great volume of the unfeeling sea itself, hot and broiling, felt the intense unending heat of the overhead sun and panted in protest. But that it does not. It heaves and rises and falls slowly in great content, as if nothing would please it more than that we should stay there forever, gently heaving, rising, and rolling too, while barnacles and tempers grow, and we roast and stew and sweat and swear. But these are passing moods. It rains and the air is cleared. It blows and the tempers are cooled. Somehow life seems better again, and the sea, though still a worried mirror of the dead sky, not utterly so heartless and bitter and cynical and depressing. Sometimes we found things and to interest us, even in the calms. A bird flew on board one evening, very tired, a land bird, by the look of him, from some lagoon in the Carolines. He rested on the mainyard, but could not balance there with the rolling. He fell onto the lifeboat cover, and we took him, expecting him to die. Some were for eating him, but I gave him water, and he rested, and the next day was lively enough, busily examining the decks for food. He was a young bird of the curlew family. We named him Oscar, and he soon made himself at home, though at first it was difficult to find something he would eat. We found some suckers on the long log rotator, and these he ate with relish. We caught some sharks, and he gobbled up the suckers from them. Before long he was not at all particular, eating whatever was going, as every one else did. He got to know his name, and ran to the galley when the cook called him. He had a bath of sea-water in the scuppers, and spent hours each day happily bathing. He was a nice bird, Oscar, though he could never get over an undue interest in fresh paint. Once another bird came, of a different type, a wild little bird, something like a brown magpie, with webbed feet, though he was not an ocean bird. Wild and intractable, the newcomer refused to be friendly, or to eat or drink or do anything. Oscar did not like him, and he soon died. We often caught sharks. The boys cut out their backbones for walking sticks, but we never tried eating them. Once, after a small shark had been lying in the scuppers nearly half an hour disemboweled, with a capstan bar rammed down its throat, it was thrown overboard and promptly swam away. We had thought it long dead. Another shark, much larger, attracted by the blood, rushed at it and ate it in a wild flurry of blood and foam, a gruesome and awful sight. The shark is a mean, low fish, and the sailor's intense and brutal hatred of him is understandable. To sharks we showed no mercy ever, but they were always with us, always ready in the calms to take the line. If there was a breeze at all, they were too lazy to keep up with us. They lolled aft in the sunny surface waters, while their little striped pilots swam here and there, examining the garbage and the bait. Several times we saw large sharks leap violently out of the water and thwack themselves down again in what seemed to us an effort to rid themselves of an undue accumulation of suckers. We would see the suckers swim away, only to be back again in a few moments. They were probably laughing. One day, in a flat calm, a school of blackfish came round the ship, and more with the idea of doing something to break the monotony of the calm than anything else. I put the dinghy in the water after them, taking the carpenter as harpooner, and the second mate with his gun. We had no lance, we could not get among the whales, try as we might, for they were timorous and easily scared. A long shark followed us persistently, in spite of cracks on the head with the boat hook and the harpoon. It attacked the oars and went for the bottom of the boat until we became tired of it and let it have the gun. It was quieter then and swam away, but in a little while it was back. There were bonita and large flying fish also about, but we caught nothing. The day passed pleasantly enough, though we caught no fish. The sunset was most beautiful, and some rain in the early evening cleared the air. Throughout this period, which passed much more pleasantly than I had ever expected, we sailed 2,200 miles in the first 3 weeks from Bongao, in spite of the very poor beginning. I had considerably more medical work to do than I had ever had before. Almost all the boys had some kind of tropic sores, mostly on the shins and feet. It was a rule of the ship that sand shoes had to be worn ashore on all tropic islands where it is stupid to go barefoot, but in spite of this some of them had infected feet. One or two had really nasty ulcers on the shins which proved most recalcitrant. The ordinary healing methods were of little use against these things, and I was busy for 2 hours a day cleaning and dressing. I still had some of the venereal patients from Bali who had been treated at Singapore and made at least non-infectious, or they would have had to leave. These were undergoing a course of treatment by subcutaneous injection, which after a little tuition I found easy enough to give them, but I missed a medical man. I had several times tried to get one. I thought there must be somewhere be a medical practitioner, young or old, who might have benefited by the voyage. If such there was, I never found him. I had to cope by myself with any medical problems which came up, and I used as far as I was able the cure of nature. That is to say, I kept the wounds cleaned and left nature to heal them. Nature is a good doctor. These tropical ulcers, however, worried me. It was very hard even to keep them clean, and to get any response out of them seemed impossible. I had 2 of the patients under treatment for 5 months, and found generally that the treatment by bandaging them with antiseptic adhesive tape and leaving it on was best in the long run. By this time the vessel was becoming rather foul on the waterline and the next strake below, and I began to think of putting into some convenient lagoon to careen her and clean the bottom. Where was there such a lagoon? The islands round those waters are principally volcanic, with few anchorages and no harbors. I did not want to stand down among the Admiralty or Bismarck group for fear of my inability to get out of them. I should have then the southeast trade, a dead headwind, and should be in a bad position. I read carefully through the sailing directions, Pacific Islands Pilot, Volume 1, and studied the charts. The only likely place seemed a lagoon, marked variously on my charts as Nissan, Sir Charles Hardy Island, and Green Island, and shown with as many different shapes as it had names. The Nuguria group might have done, but at least on most of the charts Nissan looked better. It was in a good position well to windward of New Ireland. I changed my course a little to head that way. It was more or less directly in my path. I should have gone first to Rabaul to enter the ship, since Rabaul in New Britain is the port of entry for those parts. Nissan is one of the many islands in the mandated territory of New Guinea. those former German colonies which are now controlled more or less by Australia. But I could not get to Rabaul. If I went there with a fair wind, how should I get away again? I should have an endless and dispiriting beat through St. George's Channel. I should subject my vessel to unnecessary danger, or at least to navigational difficulties which might prove her undoing. I should further lengthen a voyage which was already long enough. I made no attempt to go then towards Rabaul. This port of entry, fetish, necessary though it may be, adds immensely to the difficulties of navigating a square-rigged ship about the world in these days. If one finds, for any reason that one wishes or requires or needs to put in at any island for any purpose, one is unable to do so, short of being in actual distress, without first going to a port of entry and securing the appropriate rubber stamps. It is all very well for powered vessels, and they should be made to do it, but there is little consideration for the sailing wanderer in these days. A schooner would not be so badly off, for she can work so much better than the square-rigged ship against the wind. Windward work is a foul iron ship in purgatory in those waters. It is right enough, since all the islands have been long since portioned among the peoples of the northern hemisphere, that each should control its own, and I suppose cast the usual barriers round them. There are tariff laws and shipping restrictions and so forth. Odd vessels cannot be permitted to wander here and there at their will, doing what they like. They might cause trouble among the natives, unlawfully carry people away, or leave some behind, bring disease. But if I had any communicable disease, on board, I would not try to go to Nisan. I had nothing to land, nothing to sell. For the continued prosecution of my voyage, and in the interest of the health of all hands, I had to go to Nisan, and I could not go to Rabaul. So I went to Nisan, and left there with the trader a letter stating the facts for the administrator of Rabaul. At least I went into Nisan when I could. It proved rather difficult. I stood down past the Kapingamarangi Islands, which consist principally, so far as the chart is aware, of a large low atoll reported, I quote the latest Admiralty chart, to lie about 9 miles eastward of its charted position. Felt my way past the Lyra Reef, position doubtful, was driven one day past the Nugurias, where I did not investigate the chart's allegations here and there of good passage, safe passage, and so on, and came eventually in sight of the heights of New Ireland. Later we saw the islands Finney, Tonga, and Lihir. The wind was fresh, then from the southeast, and I had to beat standing in close towards the New Ireland shore, represented on the chart by a dotted line, but not anchoring anywhere. I kept masthead lookout the whole time, and was careful in those waters. There are no lights, and night sailing is difficult. Bearings, when almost every island is out of position, give poor guidance. We saw little of New Ireland beyond some plantations very well kept. Once 2 steamers, a Japanese and a Greek, wandered by, deep loaded with wheat from Australia. We must have been upon the Sydney Cove lane. The wind was still ahead. I beat on, carrying as much sail as the ship would stand. We were 56 days out from Singapore before the low atoll of Nisan was at last in sight. In the evening we were close by, but the place is little known and the directions are not even sure where the entrance is. It is apparently between Nisan and the small island of Barahun, and all the charts are different. It is foolish to attempt to enter such a place in bad light, without proper precautions. I shortened down and stood off and on until the morning. In the night it blew up half a gale, and we were blown away. 2 days later, after being blown away from Nisan, we were back again in a wind so fresh that the little ship staggered under the top-gallants. It rained, and the weather was dull and gloomy and threatening. I got close to the entrance, but again could not go in. I would not go in there without an examination first. I wanted to send in a boat to sound. My disagreeing charts all agreed that there were 14 feet of water in the apparent entrance but coral grows, and I wanted to know, before I took the ship that way, that what was described as apparent was also real. A ship's keel is no thing to sound with in the entrance of a coral lagoon. No, I must send in a boat, but how? The weather was too bad. I stood away again, this time in some dejection. It did not seem possible that we should ever come to Nisan, but the weather fine in the later morning, and the wind decreased, so I stood back again as close to the entrance as I could safely get, and sent in the dinghy with the carpenter and 2 of the best men, Jean and Hilgard. Their instructions were to sound thoroughly in the entrance, which they had first to find, and then if there was water enough there to float us in safety. To hoist a French flag on an oar so that I might know it was safe to bring the ship in. The French flag shows up well against the water. They went in, and we stood off and on. Then the wind freshened again, freshened and freshened, until it was blowing more than a strong breeze. The sea rose, it began to rain. The sea then increased so much that I did not think the dinghy could come out. What could I do? Wait outside until the weather cleared, or perhaps they were lost. I searched the seas anxiously, no dinghy. Wind and sea still increased, still no dinghy. We had been getting farther from the island. I wore ship again, being under short canvas, and stood in on the dangerous tack towards Barahun. The island was now a lee shore, but I had to find the dinghy. Many sharp eyes kept lookout aloft. I did not think that the dinghy would dare come out. Probably they lay in the entrance, showing the French flag, or maybe not. But there was nothing in the entrance. I stood towards the island, on and on. It was ticklish work. I did not want to stand so close on the lee shore that I could not get away again. But I must find the dinghy. Now I steered towards the entrance, the break between Nisan and Barahun, conning from the 4 cross trees. I had decided then that the dinghy must be waiting there. I would take a chance on the French flag, but there they were. They had come out in that frail pine dinghy, but they are sailors, real sailors. The sea was so high now that I could not see the dinghy until we were close upon it, and then the first thing I saw was the French flag flung high on a crest. I ran down upon them, picked them up quickly as we rolled past, and left the dinghy on a long line astern. There is an entrance, they say. It is between Nisan at Pokanine Point and Barahun. The least depth they had was 16 feet. We draw a fraction over 12. Inside the lagoon they had 12 to 20 fathoms, water enough in there. It is only the entrance that is dangerous. Well, we are pretty close now. I square up and stand in under easy canvas. The wind was increased to a moderate gale. From aloft I can see no entrance, though now we are pretty close. The sea breaks furiously on a reef which seems to extend right across. But as we come in, I see a break quite close to Barahun. How narrow! And there the bottom is clearly to be seen. 16 feet, I hope so. We are on it now. From the cross trees I see the rocks beside us, and hear the surf's roar, and see the coconut palms of Pokonine so close, and there ahead the water seems to shallow again, ominously. We have good way. She makes 8 knots, under only the fore and main topsails, the foresail, and a few staysails. With good men at the wheel, anchor, windlass, and all 4 lead lines, she rushes in. I hold my breath as she comes on. There is little sea here now, thank God for that. We straighten in the coral gateway to choose the streak of heaviest green from the confusing array of surface colors ahead, colors that vary sharply, indicating the shoals and the depth of water. I have not much time to choose. Quickly, starboard a little. She comes steady now. It is the place of darkest green in a poor selection. There seems to be a shallowing inner bar right across. 16 feet, I hope so, but there she is. She comes across. The fish flit frightened in the gloomy depths. The water deepens, and the flattened area of the huge lagoon is now around us. We are across the bar, and I have now only to choose an anchorage. I get away from the entrance and let go. Within 10 minutes the native canoes are out to us, wanting tobacco, selling pigs. Nason was first seen by Captain Carteret in his Majesty's sloop Swallow in the year 1767 on a voyage round the world. Behind that brief statement of historic fact there lies the story of one of the most remarkable and courageous voyages ever made, a voyage not much written of, not very rich in discovery, but rich in courage, determination, and human endurance beyond praise. Captain Philip Carteret, R.N., stands out even in the brave company of his fellow navigators, Byron, Wallace, with both of whom he sailed. Cook Bligh, this neglected and gallant officer, not long returned from his voyage under Commodore Byron in HMS Dolphin, was appointed to the command of the Swallow sloop to be tender to the Dolphin on a second circumnavigation. Wallace was to have the Dolphin. Carteret, being informed of this, at first felt pleased, since his voyage had given him a taste for South Seas wandering, and the hardships which in those days usually included a more than even chance of death by disease, not to speak of other risks and hazards. In no way frightened him, but one look at the Swallow made him somewhat doubtful. She was old, 30 years old, and she never had been much good. She was obviously unhandy, the sort of clumsy vessel that makes a sailor's heart go down within him, a vessel in which no mariner on earth could take much pride. Why she had been chosen for the important service she was about to perform, Carteret did not know, and he began to think she was intended to accompany the Dolphin only as far as the Falklands, there to be relieved by a more suitable vessel, if she reached the Falklands, of course. As he watched his new charge being fitted out, the conviction grew on him that she could not possibly be intended for a voyage round the world, while the Dolphin was well supplied with everything she could want, including a considerable quantity of iron for gifts to the natives, and a forge for working it, and trinkets and toys of all descriptions. The Swallow received nothing beyond bare necessities and scant allowance of them. Several times Captain Carteret petitioned the Lords of the Admiralty for some better provision for his vessel, which he perceived was not even to be properly supplied with rope or with junk for making it. His petitions went unheeded. In answer to his queries, he was told that the Dolphin held enough, but as all long voyages of vessels in company had shown, there was grave danger of the ships being parted. The Swallow should have been properly equipped on her own account. She was not. She was not even given proper sheathing against the ravages of the tropic worm, though it was usual, when sending vessels on tropical employments, to provide them with well-fastened extra planking as a defense against the destructive tornado. There was nothing on board to trade with natives, either to secure their goodwill or for profit. The vessel was overcrowded, and even at her berth, before the beginning of the voyage, she was leaky. In this poor old tub, Captain Carteret, with Captain Wallis and the Dolphin, set out for Plymouth Sound on Friday, August 22nd, 1766, bound on a voyage of exploration and discovery to the South Sea and round the world. The object of this voyage was more particularly to discover the southern continent, the probable existence of which had been discussed by geographers and scientists for many years. With this in view, the ships were to double the Horn, or work through the Straits of Magellan into the South Seas, and proceed westwards in high latitude, looking for what they might find. This no ship had ever done. They were to be no exception to the rule. Such a voyage would certainly have been attempted the other way, but the recommendations of Lieutenant Maury for making eastwards passages in high latitudes were not then known. Long before Maury had ever, Cook was to make this passage from the west to the east. Bligh followed him on the first commercial voyage to Tahiti. At sea it was quickly found that the Swallow would neither tack nor steer, nor could she, under all sail, keep up with the Dolphin under reefed topsails. This was galling to Wallis and Carteret alike, but they went on, putting in at Madeira as their last civilized port. Here occurred an incident which ought to have been brought to the attention of William Bligh, later commander of His Majesty's transport Bounty. 9 of the Swallow's seamen, having some money but no leave, swam ashore naked from the anchorage, with their money and kerchiefs tied round their heads, but finding the surf too great to land, had to swim out again. They were hauled before Carteret, expecting to be flogged. They were 9 of his best seamen, and Carteret well knew that they did not intend to desert. They explained that they sought nothing but, at last, skinful of liquor, before the ship finally departed from civilization, and both by looks and words expressed their contrition and their willingness to undergo any punishment that might have been given them. Carteret saying that he hoped they would risk their lives only on more important occasions in future, observed that if he required good swimmers for any enterprise, he knew now where to apply for them, and told the men to put on some clothes and turn in. A murmur of satisfaction, we are told, ran instantly through the whole ship's company at an act of kindness which was extraordinary in those days. Henceforth Carteret, who had already shown himself a fearless and resourceful commander, had every man in that ship thoroughly behind him. In the course of time, the poor Swallow arrived at the Straits of Magellan and passed through. Carteret now asked Wallis what he should do. The sloop was obviously nothing but a nuisance to the larger vessel. He himself thought it best to scrap the Swallow, or send her home with the sick. He would stay, he offered, as first lieutenant of the Dolphin under Wallace, feeling that he could be of more use there. If he remained in the ill-found Swallow, he could be nothing but a hindrance to the expedition. But Captain Wallace had his orders and stuck to them. These stated that the Swallow was to accompany the expedition. However, the straits were no sooner successfully passed than the Dolphin sailed out of sight, and was not again seen by those in the Swallow. Nor would Wallace consent to put proper stores aboard his less fortunate consort, feeling perhaps that he might need all he had for himself. After vicissitudes which would have dismayed any weak man and a good many strong men, Carteret now found himself in a leaking and ill-found ship, which was unfit to make the passage from Spithead to Plymouth under her own sail, without sufficient stores or food. Left at the Pacific end of the Straits of Magellan to find the rest of his way round the world, he could have doubled the Horn to the eastward at once and sailed home that way, but he was made of sterner stuff. The orders were that his vessel should proceed on the journey. Very well, she did. She at once encountered a gale which lasted 23 days, in the course of which she was several times nearly lost and extricated from perilous positions only by the most consummate skill in seamanship. During all this time she experienced an uninterrupted course of dangers, fatigues, and exertions. She worked and sailed very ill. The weather was dark and tempestuous, and the boats which the exigencies of the ship kept constantly employed were in continual danger of being lost. She would neither tack nor wear without a boat or a couple of boats to pull her round. These then had constantly to be swung out and used, which was difficult work in bad weather. For some days the ship lay to under bare poles, and the water at times was torn up and whirled round in the air, much higher than the mast heads. Captain Carteret made for the island of Juan Fernandez to take in wood and water and refresh the crew, but he found the place a Spanish fortress, and sailed for Mas Afuera, since we could not suppose the Spaniards well disposed to receive English visitants. At Mas Afuera he found a high surf. Anchoring with difficulty, he was blown away and was 3 days beating back again, but he took in some water, though no refreshments. He then stood to the westward in accordance with the general orders for the voyage, but it was the winter season in the far south, and it was impossible to make much westing without going into the region of the southeast trade. However, he held grimly on, doing his best to carry sail to drive the sluggish ship in order to prevent the possibility of perishing by famine. He discovered Pitcairn's Island, named after a son of Major Pitcairn, who fell at Bunker Hill, who saw it first, but they could not land there. Other similar islands were seen, not one of them offering the slightest refreshment to the now starving and scurvy-stricken crew. The ship, to make a bad position very much worse, now admitted great quantities of water, and was otherwise in a very crazy condition. Her sails were rotten, and her rigging, which was of course rope, began to go, nor had they any rope with which to repair it. They were forced to the expedient of cutting a length from the hempen cable, and after reducing this to the original oakum from which it was made, starting afresh to spin yarn and make rope of the size they needed. They had no proper tools for this work, and had to make them. More and more men went down to scurvy. They began to die. Carteret himself was seriously ill, so ill that his recovery was despaired of. There was no surgeon. The first lieutenant was also ill. Carteret and he were the only navigators. Still they fought their way westward against winter gales and fierce adversity. Sticking to their orders, working through uncharted seas in their crazy ship. The Swallow was now so foul she would not answer the helm, and they had constantly to use boats to pull her round. Carteret seemed to be dying. Now, having crossed most of the Pacific between the 20th and 13th parallels of south latitude, he decided that he must give up the intention of continuing on that difficult course, and bend all his energies toward getting the ship and the survivors home somehow. He therefore stood up towards the trades. Had he had a proper vessel, or had the wretched Swallow even possessed 1/4 of the equipment she should have had on board, Carteret in all probability would have forestalled the famous Cook as the real discoverer of Australia. However, he was not to have the honor of any great discoveries, though his accomplishment was not lessened by that. He stood up now towards the Santa Cruz Islands, and saw them. He anchored off Santa Cruz, hoping to be able to establish friendly relations with the natives and secure at least some coconuts. But the excessive stupidity of the master, who sent to find a better anchorage where the ship could be careened, went ashore instead and cut down coconut trees, caused almost immediate hostilities. The master himself was killed, and 3 of the best surviving seamen died of arrow wounds. 7 other seamen were seriously wounded. The Swallow was leaking more than ever. Carteret, who could scarcely stand erect on his deck, could see pigs and coconuts and fruit ashore, but he had had nothing with which to placate the natives, and he did not want to open fire on them. He went on. Before leaving, he had been forced to fire on some of the natives in order to land a watering party. They took in water, but of fresh food they had none. He determined to stand on towards the place called by Dampier, New Britain, where there might be sustenance of some kind. It was on the way here that he discovered the Carteret Islands and Nason. We called this flat green isle Sir Charles Hardy's Island, says the account of the voyage, but they did not go in. They had no one to man the boats to pull the bedraggled sloop into Nason Lagoon, and they knew well enough that if they did go in there, they could expect little help from the Melanesians, a wild, fierce pack in those early days. So the Swallow sailed by, and when at last she came to an anchor off New Britain, and some fresh food could be found, not the combined strength of all hands could weigh the anchor. They had to wait until they were strong enough to go on. Still, they sailed westwards with the Swallow now sinking. 13 men were dead, and 30 more dying. The natives of the Admiralty Islands, which Carteret named, attacked them. South of Mindanao, a large pirate prow of the Moros opened fire on them, to receive a raking broadside that sent her, doubtless mightily astonished, at once to the bottom. The north monsoon had set in. They could not go to windward against it or reach Batavia. Carteret took the stricken ship into the Celebes port of Macassar, and sent a note ashore asking the governor for leave to buy food and to shelter and refresh the crew. The governor replied by ordering him to get out at once and to anchor nowhere on those coasts. They were of the wrong nationality. "Good sir," said Carteret to this unbelievably swinish official, "I will run my ship ashore in your town, and we will sell our lives there as dear as possible, if you do not grant me this permission." He weighed his anchor with great difficulty and stood towards the town. He was given the leave he sought, but many of his crew died. The deplorable condition of the ship was repaired as well as it might be, but since she should have been condemned, she was still far from seaworthy even after her overhaul. In the East Indies, more of the crew died. but Carteret himself lived to bring his indifferent charge homewards round Good Hope by way of Table Bay, St. Helen, and Ascension. Speaking M. de Bougainville's Bordeaux on the way, he anchored at Spithead on March 20th, 1769, after a voyage of 2 years and 7 months. Such a man then was the discoverer of Nisan. I thought of him and his poor Swallow as I looked round me at the anchorage. In the evening I landed at Poco 9 to watch the primitive natives broiling their evening meal of fish taken straight from the lagoon, and walk a while through the white man's abandoned plantation on the point. Here the Great Depression had sent the buildings derelict, and the coconuts lie strewn heavily on the sodden ground. Now the sun is out, and its setting over the broad lagoon is beautiful. The quietened wind sings softly in the high palms of the blue water's lap, lazily on the golden inner beach, while the surf of the wild Pacific roars outside. It is all peaceful and romantic and vaguely adventurous, as a South Seas island ought to be. But in the lagoon the long shapes of hungry sharks are often to be seen, and the fierce stingray abounds. The golden beach soon gives way to a jagged coral strand, poisonous to the bare feet. Behind the plantation clearing, the jungle is dank, moldy swamp, and through the high palms it soon rains. Then it seems that this is not at all what a South Seas island ought to be. The people I saw were Melanesian, and I'm afraid not very interesting. They might have been once, but now the remnant of them is gloomy, scabby, sad. A wholesome, upstanding, clean-skinned specimen is rare. Perhaps the recruiters have taken all of those away, and only the rejects remain. But in all truth they are not very attractive, and the men are more handsome than the women. They are quiet, speak pidgin English volubly, wear loincloths, and, if at all possible, felt hats, live in grass houses in small compact villages, dislike work but like bargaining, and tobacco, especially tobacco. For this they brought out fish, coconuts, fruit, limes, pigs, bows, and arrows, everything they had, but it had to be the right kind of tobacco, a strong black twist of American manufacture, used as currency among the remoter South Seas islands for years. Besides this, they always demanded a supply of paper, newspaper for preference, though a few pieces of toilet paper would do. With this they rolled themselves stout cigarettes, one whiff from which would send many a European under the table. They were also mildly interested in highly perfumed soap, though I think it was the perfume that attracted, in gaily colored laps, loincloths, and in peroxide. They used this to bleach their hair, a fashion that had been current among them for years, although formerly they used lime. A head of thick peroxided hair, surmounted by a brilliant red flower, and a Nisan brave feels good enough for anyone. I had no peroxide to spare. What I had I used for medicinal purposes, and this the natives regarded as a great waste. They were nice fellows. They hung about in their canoes all day, and looked on in wonder while we worked. There was work enough to do. I had gone in there to heave down the ship, if I could, to clean at least the upper strakes beneath the waterline. To do this, I first roughly surveyed the lagoon, choosing a place where I could bring the ship in almost to the beach, which rose steeply and was lined with trees. I brought her there and anchored her, bow and stern, mooring her in line with the beach at a place where she would just take the ground at low water. Then I carried out lines to the trees to hold her fast, and rigged tackles from the fore and main crosstrees to the largest of them. When everything was ready, all hands hove away on the tackles at low water, heaving the ship over. She came fairly easily at first, but then stubbornly, so that it took all hands a hard morning's hauling to get her sufficiently over. It was interesting work. No one in the ship, including myself, had ever seen it done before. It was prehistoric almost, like the single topsail ship. But we enjoyed it. We cleaned the ship and learned a lot. We stayed in under the trees until the cleaning was complete, and then warped out to sea to a safe anchorage. It blew fresh every day, and every day it rained. Rained and rained and rained, though this was not supposed to be the rainy season. The rain poured into the gloomy lagoon, fringed heavily with its monotonous circle of wet trees. The water was not blue on days like those, but black. The sun shone seldom, and outside the Pacific surf pounded ceaselessly on the coral. The island is all coral. Coral crops out everywhere. Crabs scurry, huge bloated things, and lean pigs grunt in the marshes. Through the water fish flit, multicolored at tremendous speed, the waving frond-like arms of the starfish and the octopus stretch from their prey from every sea-wet rock. In the forest the smell is of dead land, rank, black, almost putrid, repellent, and awful. This was no tropic paradise, not Nissan's gloomy, huge lagoon. Yet when the sun shines it is attractive enough, even beautiful in a somber way, and there are fair coves on Barahun. But in the lagoon sea snakes swim, and sharks by the foreshore. You dare not paddle for the poison prongs of the vindictive stonefish lurking invisibly. Morose Nissan, it all seems brooding, resentful, sad, as if it did not care for the coming of the white man, the sailing gods who brought copra, and weird beliefs that never seemed to bother them very much, and a fierce desire for profit and for trade. No, perhaps Nissan does not care for the changes that have come over it since Captain Carteret first sailed by, and the white man long afterwards came among the islands.